My name is Joshua Gibson, and you are listening to the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast, a show dedicated to promoting a message of critical thinking as it pertains to strength training, nutrition, and well-being. This is done through interviews with experts, high-level athletes, coaches, and people heavily involved in strength sports and athletic development. Pull up a chair, grab a coffee, and let's get on to today's podcast. And we are live. This is your host, Joshua Gibson, with, I don't even know what episode number this is. I haven't recorded a podcast in what seems like ages. And the most recent episodes, they were some of the best, and sadly I had to shut down my account. So all of the other episodes, I think like the first 80 episodes of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast are up on YouTube. I'm going to restart this podcasting channel and start uploading more frequently. And I thought, who better to have on? And I'm sure there are better guests. Let's be completely honest. I'm not going to suck up to Kevin, but who better to have on than Kevin Cann, coach of precision powerlifting, powerlifter himself, and could I say strength enthusiast? Is that appropriate?
I think that's appropriate. Okay.
Well, how are you doing, Kevin? Give us an update on kind of where you're at within the whole pandemic space.
Well, I mean, after that shitty introduction from you, I mean, the pandemic, I guess, was a blessing and a curse all at the same time. So, I think one of the things that it really did is it made coaches and lifters alike really think about whether they wanted to be involved in the strength sports to begin with. It makes you start questioning your dedication to it, your motivations to do it, and all that good stuff. So I was coaching a lot of my group in person, so I was probably at the gym 60 plus hours a week, which limits my, I guess, abilities to actually think things through, right? You're kind of just living your life one day at a time because of how busy it gets at times. Mm-hmm. So what it's given me more time to do is I have less people to coach now, and I have more time to myself to actually think about training and think about what we've been doing, what we should be doing, and kind of one of the things that I really used this time for was to get back to the basics. I went down to my basement, I dusted off super training and science and practices, and I started to reread these old texts and just bring myself back to the beginning of where I started and start to really think about our training process. Because we've had good success, and sometimes you can get blinded by the good success that you end up having because a lot of my lifters haven't even been lifting for 5 years. So no matter what I had them do, they're probably going to see that good success. So you can sit there and pat yourself on the back for the success that some of them had. And some of it just may be their genetic abilities. And it has absolutely nothing to do with my coaching. But in order to develop higher level lifters. So we've had top 5 finishes. We've had top 10 finishes. We've won checks at the Arnold. We've competed at the Arnold a lot. But we haven't made that next step. So it's we get into those on those higher level platforms, but we're not winning those higher level competitions. We're just, what I say to my lifters when they're in there, I'm you're just a filler here because they need to fill out a flight. You're the weakest one in the room, and you should always be the weakest one in the room. But in order for us to make those next steps forward, there was a lot of things that we just were not doing in our programming and stuff. And I just use this time to go back to the basics and really redefine our process and put it together. And I think a much more, and I hate this term, but a much more functional way for athlete development.
Yeah. And I think the impetus for this podcast and kind of the evolution, I guess, of the way you've started thinking about training is evident on your Patreon channel. I think you said it's akin to strength school. You may have called it that or said you were going to start something like that. But anyways, it's entirely focused on, I say powerlifting, but the concepts are applicable into other sports, probably like weightlifting. And there's a lot of content on general principles and then using those principles to guide programming and then using programming methods to guide long-term planning. So it's kind of like a pretty comprehensive look at the way you think about training and then the way you implement it in a practical setting. And you even have technique videos where you're looking at squats and kind of teaching the basics, but also some more nuanced points. And it's really good. I highly recommend people go check it out. And of course, I'll leave a link in the description below. But to start, I think it's always useful to kind of rewind a bit and go back to the beginnings. And when you kind of started to shy away from those previous concepts, right? So you said you took time to go back to the basics, the foundational texts, and I've noticed that your programming has looked different. I noticed that some of the concepts are used differently. Um, what kind of what did it look like before? And we talked about this before we went on air, but what did your programming look like, and how did you actively start to work? Maybe not away from it, but how did you actively start to change it? And what concepts are you still trying to wrestle with to understand and work on refining?
So basically what it was like before is it was more just like day to day and week to week. So there wasn't really like a long-term focus to things. And I think, so when we went to the Arnold in March, there wasn't a lot to do because they actually like canceled the Arnold, but the meets were still happening. So my lifter was lifting in the Pro American, which was on Sunday, and we got there on Friday. So there were meets on Friday and Saturday, and we're sitting there in the stands just watching the competition Friday afternoon. And we were just having like this long conversation about like the training process and building strengths and weaknesses. And like the lifter that I had just done nationals in October, then the Arnold in March. And this was our first Arnold and stuff, but there was a lot of stuff that we were working on that sometimes gets put on hold because you have bigger competitions coming up. And we were just talking about like having a longer off season, like really pushing the weaknesses and targeting those weaknesses and, you know, just like a more long-term mindset to training as opposed to like going out in every competition, just, you know, balling out and trying to hit PRs and like just having a better plan in general. And it just like really got my wheels turning because it's like, you know, and I had already been like wrestling with these ideas. I had a conversation with like Mike Teixeira right before, and it's like, is long-term planning important? Yeah, we can't predict, but like it's got to be, because if you look at the history of the sport, like long-term planning is something that every PhD or older coach literally pushes in your face as being important. I understand we can't predict things, but we got to know where we're going. And so after that conversation, and like this lifter's only been lifting for 3 years, and she's on one of the biggest stages in the sport. And like she has a lot of potential, and just got me like really thinking that like I need to have a better plan in order to take this lifter from where we are now to making those next steps, to being competitive. Not that she's not competitive at a national level, but being competitive enough to win at a national level, and then competing and being competitive enough at a world level. Like, what does it take to get there? Because I think when you look at like programming and coaching or whatever you want to like break it up into, there's shitty coaching, of course, and shitty programs, but I think the majority is good. You have good programs, good coaches, but then to be great and to get people to make that next step, there's very, very few of those. And if you actually like start thinking about like, okay, so what did the great coaches actually do? And they all had these plans, these long-term plans. And one of the biggest things I think for me when I was thinking about this, because, you know, having worked with Shaco for 3 years when I first started, is I got a good taste of the process of this, was the patience of it. Like they never reacted to day-to-day stuff. It was just like when something happened, it's like, just move on, see what happens the next day. Like they kind of suspended judgment on making changes to those programs because they had a plan. They trusted in the plan. The plan followed general principles. And like just think of all the things that can affect performance, like how much you slept, how much you ate, but even like caffeine ingestion, what music is on the radio, who you're around, what happened that previous day. It's so variable that I was in the process of allowing those day-to-day fluctuations. And we're in this like fad of like subjective feelings more important than objective truths in terms of training. And I got sucked into that where like, oh, well, if somebody's feeling this way or feeling that way, we should adjust. We should do all of these things. But when you start doing that, you start like really messing with that long-term plan. So I stopped doing that quite as much. And I want them to communicate those things with me, of course. But at the same time, like, the Russians were not big fans of utilizing RPE for the strength sports because of the variability that it brings. Like, their load management strategies, they trusted what was on that paper, and they knew how to adjust what was on that paper based off of each individual athlete. So once you started bringing in subjective feelings, it just creates this load variability nightmare in their programs. And so that was one of the things that, like, I really wanted to do, is like get back. Like, Shaco had always made it a point that load variability is one of the most important aspects of training. So, like, how can I get these load variability principles lined up into my current programs? And like, when we were doing more Shaco stuff, we weren't doing max effort lifts. So it's obviously much easier to do it under those scenarios, because the max effort stuff is very different than doing the submaximal effort work. Mm-hmm. So it brought me into this, like, okay, well, here are the principles, right? It doesn't matter how heavy the weight is, right? Here are the general principles. And then I literally went through 3 years of programs, between mine with his and mine with all my lifters. And I found all these, like, average intensities that ended up working. So they didn't always work, but so I analyzed every lift from 70% and higher, and just, like, kind of came up with these, like, volume heuristics that there's a certain amount of work that you need to put in no matter how you feel. So I took those numbers, and then when you start thinking about, like, your max effort and the rep work that you need to do and stuff, and it's like, okay, well, max effort stuff, I did a year of all singles. It's not physiologically daunting. It's more like psychological than anything else. Like, there's a reason why in those studies people get anxiety, depression, burnout, like stuff like that. So, like, learning how to navigate those, like, that psychological toolbox while you're going through training was quite a process. So I still use this, like, high, medium, low approach, but, like, think of it in terms of, like, max effort being high psychological stress, low physiological stress, and high volume work being high physiological stress, low psychological stress, and just started blending it together to start, like, working things, making sure within a month we're getting the average number of lifts we should get, getting the max effort work when we can. And then, it's individualized based off of the well-being of each lifter. So if I have a lifter that can just handle more work, they're just going to have more high stress days, whether it's more max effort, whether it's more higher volume days. They can handle more work. They'll be able to get stronger over a period of time. I mean, ultimately, that's probably what defines the elite from the non-elite the most, is their ability to tolerate work. It's probably more of a hereditary genetic thing than anything else. And then I started getting into the thought of, all right, well, I can do that week to week. That's great. But what about, like, stretching it out over a longer term? So for powerlifting, most lifters compete, let's say, twice a year. So I came up with phases of training that would last about 6 months. So anywhere between 4 and 6 months, because it seems to be the average gap between each competition. So what I'm wrestling with now is longer than that 4 to 6 month period of time. So, like, I have a nice setup, I think, that it's workable and we can just pay attention to things for that 4 to 6 months. But what about over the course of 4 to 6 years or something like that? That's kind of, I think, the next step that we're getting into.
Okay. And you mentioned a lot of concepts, and just to quickly break them down, or at least break a couple down. So when you refer to Shaco, I'll just explain this for the audience. You are referring to, and you mentioned it, like a more Russian style. And in the weightlifting world, I think this is more well understood, where there's an emphasis on volume, lower training intensities. Typically in weightlifting, it would be more variation. I don't know how Shaco programmed that in.
Of it was variation.
Yeah, and then it was, like, really focused on the long term, and it didn't have, maybe it had a 90% single here and there, but it wasn't usually like a max out thing, or what we think of as, like, the opposite, which is Bulgarian style training. I remember an interesting story that Glenn Pindlay told about Russian coaches in the back room at, like, a world championship. And I think the Russian lifter was going out for their attempts, and they looked incredibly easy. And he was asking them about attempt selection. And he's like, yeah, they've made this in the gym. Like, why would pretty much the idea was, why would we put anything on the bar that they haven't done already? And I think of that approach being more conservative, um, more workmanlike, more comprehensive. Was that an accurate representation of kind of how the Shaco program was?
Yeah, so it was always matching your best gym lifts was the goal at a competition. And part of it was, so like, he went undefeated in the 7 years he coached the Russian national team in international competition. And his whole thing was go 6 for 6 through squats and bench and then pull for a win. So if you're making your lifts, it puts a lot of pressure on other people to, like, if you're guessing what your 1RM is, chances are you're going to miss a lot more reps. So they were just even though they were conservative attempts, they didn't miss.
Mm-hmm.
So them not missing puts a lot of pressure on the competition to be able to do things. And they had huge pulls, so that probably played into attempt selection as well. But Shaco's style came from weightlifting because he was a weightlifting coach first. So like Arkady Vorobyov came up with the load variability strategy that Shaco used. So it was these high, medium, and low stress training days that were dispersed throughout a training week and even weeks. So he has all these like heuristics of like, what is a high volume week? What is a high volume day? So like one of the things, if we have, I'm going to do some like quick little math here. So let's say in a month, our average number of lifts is 600 lifts, but we train 4 days a week. So in that month, there's 16 training days. If we take that 600 and divide it by the number of training days being 16, that means an average volume training day would be about 37 lifts. Mm-hmm. So then a 10 to 20% increase or a 10 to 20% decrease on either side would be a high or a low day. And what he would do is, in terms of recovery, so a higher stress day might take 48 to 72 hours to recover from, but it doesn't mean you can't do something 2 days later, right? But that day might be lower. So it was just these like pulses of physical activity that they would throw into the program at given times. And some weeks would be higher, some would be lower, but they would never have to deload because they had this like paradoxical approach that you were pushing forward and pulling back almost at the exact same time. So you get this like steady long-term progress. And what they found, so I would imagine the listeners of this know who Arkady Vorobyov is because he was a 3-time Olympian and he was a sports scientist. And like what they had determined was that doing it this way had 61% greater success than having a more traditional approach to training. And part of it, I think, when you actually go through it is you're mentally always in it, right? Because like when you feel like shit, a lower or medium stress training day, like an average training day, you should be able to recover from within 24 hours. And then the lower stress days are for recovery. It just never feels easy. There's like this just like hard, you're going into the gym, you're doing your work, and it's just, you continuously just do that over and over and over. And it builds this like you said, this like blue collar workmanship in terms of the sport. And I have found that for me with my lifters to be a more appropriate way of adjusting loads than trying to get this like functional overreach and then pulling back and waiting for this super compensation to happen, because like you don't know what you need to get a person who has a full-time job, who has stress outside of the gym, like to get them to functionally overreach, I think is an extremely difficult thing to do as a coach without breaking them down and knowing how long it takes them to recover from. And I just found this to be just a lot more fluid in terms of steady, incremental, stable progress.
Yeah. And I mean, my head was spinning when you were talking about that, because I just have so many things that I think are relevant to the conversation, and I kind of have a framework we can operate under now. So I think we should take this from the short to long term. And one thing I kind of indirectly stumbled upon this, and I think that's how a lot of coaching happens, is you kind of indirectly stumble upon what works, and then people talk about it, and then the next generation kind of thinks about it, and they read about that, and they're like, well, that doesn't sound right, that probably doesn't work, and then they indirectly stumble upon it as well and figure out the same exact thing. But I've been reading a lot about resistance priming, and Zach from Data Driven Strength, he's been putting stuff about this up on his Instagram. So, I've just been thinking about it. He's been writing about it, which is the difference between him and I. But basically the idea is you have some sort of lighter well, it's not necessarily lighter. It can be relatively heavy. I think anywhere from like 60 to 85% weights, and as long as you're changing the volumes based on the load on the bar. So using lower loads if you have higher weights, and a little bit lower volumes if you have higher weights, and then higher volumes if you have lower weights, and using that with specific movements that you want to potentiate. If you use that, 6 to 33 hours before a major session, you see an increase in performance. Why exactly? I don't think the researchers know. They think it's either some sort of neuromuscular thing or it's hormonal, but obviously more research is needed, and that's completely irrelevant. Basically, I've been reading about that concept and I've been using it in the programming we have, where we have a heavy day on Saturday for some people. Some people, it just didn't seem to work very well. I actually noticed for like the smaller girls having a lighter session before a heavier one. I think it spaced out the sessions a little too much, and they didn't respond super well. So, but I give people like a 60% on a really technical variation, and we'll do 3 sets of 2, and we'll do that, and then we'll do a really heavy like quarter squat basically. And we'll take that up however heavy we need to do it, just to kind of keep the progression alive. But we'll do that before a really heavy session. And I can't say obviously if it entirely worked or if that's the reason people were lifting well, but I kind of indirectly stumbled upon like medium, light, heavy, and thinking about it more in that like abstract context, I think makes more sense for programming, and it makes it more easier. Like it makes it easier to communicate. So my question, and I always kind of come back to the underpinnings of this stuff. Like we can talk about it and using these concepts and how effective they are, but how do you decide, or how do you go about saying, okay, we're going to structure a microcycle, a training week in this way and organize it in this way, and then how do you follow that up with another training microcycle that reflects the previous? Because I've talked to a lot of people on different podcasts about tracking training metrics like number of lifts, like average intensities, and all of these things, and it's all very useful. But I still haven't really picked up on how to proactively apply it. Like I can write out a microcycle and say, okay, maybe we just want fewer squats here, fewer pulls here. And then the next training block, okay, we did around 150 lifts. This block should be heavier. Let's do 130 because it's like 10% less, right? So I can see that and make those decisions. But you, Kevin, when you're writing out a training cycle, say a mesocycle or a microcycle, how are you determining the heavy, medium, light structure? And I think this kind of fits in with the concept of maximal effort work, acting almost as an anchor for those training days.
So we have a structure to our programs to begin with. So one of the things that, like getting back to the question you asked in the beginning, like we didn't have a lot of structure before. Mm-hmm. So like day-to-day fluctuations would kind of dictate a lot of that structure, but now we have a structure. So like day 1, we do max effort squats, or depending on the phase in training we'll do some rep work every other week or whatever. Day 2, our max effort bench. So like the way that it's set up is day 1 is, let's say on Monday, max effort squat. Day 2 is on Wednesday, max effort bench. Day 3, let's say we're in phase 1 of a program, we're doing high volume on this day. So we got squats and deadlifts, rep work, we're getting like 50 reps, right? So it's 10% more of that 35 or whatever. And then day 4, we'll do like rep work, bench work. So when you look at the structure of it, so based off of the recovery times, right? So a high stress day should be able to recover from within 48 to 72 hours. So they're not doing another squat and deadlift until Friday. Mm-hmm. So there's systemic stuff that builds up. Don't get me wrong. You can't just go upper, lower, and be fine. Like there is this cumulative stress that builds up. Mm-hmm. So even between Wednesday and Friday, there's 48 hours. So I write out 1 month at a time, and I put best scenario, like here are the number of lifts we're looking for. Here's the average intensity. Here's how it all blends together in a month. So we're getting all the work, we're getting all the max effort lifts. And I think the other important aspect is we need to think about what we're trying to develop during this training block. Mm-hmm. I think people confuse periodization as programming, and they're two entirely different things. So you get the structure, but the program is going to dictate the periodization. Mm-hmm. So if we're in a first phase, what I want them to be able to do is in our competition phase and phase 3 of our programs, handle more max effort work. So what are the things that we need to do now to be able to handle more later on? So we need to build work capacity. We need to build that volume. We need to build the recovery ability of the lifter to handle those higher intense workloads later on. So when I write out that week, they then put their information in. So I have them put the weight that they hit and last set RPEs, and then any notes that they feel they need to tell me. Mm-hmm. They should be able to easily recover with the gaps that I'm putting in this program. So, but let's say they hit their max effort squat, their max effort bench, and then day 3, their volume deadlifts. So their volume squats and deadlifts, they're 70% 5x5 for both and some variation or comp lifts, whatever we're doing. And they just feel heavy as fuck. So there's 2 things that could be going on here. They're either not prepared to handle those workloads, number 1. And so then that becomes the goal. So then maybe in the following week, we just adjust. We drop the workloads a little bit. So instead of a 5x5, maybe we do 8x3s. Mm-hmm. And then when the 8x3 is easier, then we progress into a 6x4, then a 5x5. So then the goal of the block becomes, let's develop that work capacity from where they are now to be able to handle what the work that I want them to be able to do in this phase. And that obviously can stretch out the length of a phase because it's going to be dependent upon the lifter themselves. Or it's really heavy and, you're talking to them and you're looking through their program and it's like they're not recovering well. So then it just becomes, all right, maybe this lifter, so like how I was saying before, a max effort lift, and this is hard to follow, I think sometimes, is high stress psychologically. Mm-hmm. High volume is physiologically high stress, right? So if you look at a week like that, so let's say I'm putting 50 lifts in there, which would be a high volume day, that's a high stress day still. And we're still getting high stress max effort. And then usually the bench volume days, low to medium effort in terms of like what they're putting on that sheet. So if they can't handle that many high stress days, I need to adjust. So I may in the following week decide to split up their volume a little bit differently. So instead of giving them 50 lifts on that day 3, now mind you, this is already written out. So like I would just go into the next week and then make these adjustments. So instead of giving them the 50 lifts on day 3, I could cut it down to a medium day. So maybe now I cut 15 reps off of that total. So instead of a 5x5, and let's say we're doing comp squats, this would never happen in phase 1, but let's say we're doing comp squats 70% 5x5, I might do 2-second pause 70% 5x3. So the time under tension is going to be very similar, but the load's going to drop. So the amount of work that they're doing is actually going to be a little bit less. So I'm cutting 10 reps there, and then maybe I cut the deadlifts down a set or something, or they do a 5x4 instead of a 5x5, something like that. But then what I would do is on that day 1 max effort day, I would use that same variation and then a percentage off of that variation to get the difference. So let's say we had to make up about 12 reps. I would hit that max effort lift, use that same variation, 70% of what they just hit for a 4x3. Mm-hmm. So one of the things that Charlie Francis talked about in his high-low approach, he compared and of course, this is probably not scientifically accurate, but I think it gets the point across well. So like old school gym lights, they take 15, 20 minutes to ramp up once you turn them on, for those of you who aren't old enough to remember these. And he talked about the energy consumption of these lights, where it's actually the ramping up process that utilizes the most energy. But once they're on. And there's not a ton of energy that's kind of going into doing more at that point. I mean, of course there is some, but it's not a lot. So what I can do there is that's still a high stress day, whether I have back downs or whether I don't. So if I add a few back downs in there, I can keep the number of lifts the exact same, but allow them to recover better towards the end of the week. So now they're handling those 2-second pause squats. They're handling, let's say I did a 5x4 instead of a 5x5 on the deadlifts or something. Now they're handling that volume, and then I can gradually build it up because the goal of that first phase, again, at that point is to build that work capacity. And the first conversation I had with Louis Simmons, because one of the things that I was saying was, what would end up happening is we were doing our max effort lifts earlier in the week. But then the weight had to be so light on those day 3 and day 4s later in the week because the lifters just weren't recovering and able to handle the heavier weights. And he said it's just because you're not conditioned enough. So that really, like, I was like, okay, so in our first phase, we have to make sure we're developing the work capacity and the conditioning in order to be able to do this stuff later on. So like, well, the goal becomes there is, okay, if that's all I'm capable of doing on this day, that's the goal of the phase, right? So like, that's where, you know, I think when you even look at like something like block periodization, when they talk about like an accumulation phase, like there's a reason that stuff exists and that thought process exists. Now, I don't utilize a block periodization type of scheme. However, there's some concepts that I utilize because there is a reason why they do that before and why they've seen success doing that. So I think having that goal in that first phase of being able to do that, and then just letting that goal and the results of each training week kind of dictate where you go. So each phase of ours will be usually between like 4 and 8 weeks. So like 1 to 2 waves that we end up doing. If the first wave, they can't hit that 5x5 on both, like they're just not recovering and I can't cycle back through and do the same thing, maybe I extend it even to 12 weeks if I have to at that point, until they accomplish the goal of that wave under those loads to then be able to push it to the next step. And then same thing, once they hit these certain metrics, then I'll push it to the next step. So it's still following that structure and that outline and that short and long-term plan, but I'm not forcing it. I'm allowing their training to kind of dictate the decisions and directing it towards the adaptations that I'm looking for at that point in time, if that even makes any sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think it expanded well on my question, and I think it directs us well to the max effort work. And this is something I was thinking a lot about. And I just think weightlifting and powerlifting are two interesting sports. And in weightlifting, I was actually explaining this to someone yesterday. We can do a ton of different exercises and hit a bunch of different rep PRs. And for like a weightlifter, that's all meaningful. But I don't see that as much in powerlifting, at least like in raw powerlifting. So for example, I was talking to you know, the person about it, and I said, you know, if you hit a 5 rep max PR in your good morning, like that's a meaningful metric. That actually is really useful for our training. The same could be said about some sort of like pause clean or something, or tempo clean, or you know, or different squat variations. So like a banded squat, or a pause squat, or a safety squat bar squat, or something. Like all of this stuff matters. More than I think if I were to say, hey, I hit a good morning 5 rep max PR in powerlifting, people would be like, cool story. Like, I don't give a fuck. And this kind of circles back to that whole concept of specificity versus transference, and specificity being multifaceted and not just the constraints of the competition. But, you know, when we talked about general principles earlier, we're also looking at general principles here. So what is it? What does it mean to be specific? Well, it means we have similar velocities. We have similar contraction types. We have similar ranges of motion. So like there are way more variables at play than just I need calibrated plates or a combo rack or a low bar position. Like it's way more complicated. And specificity, a cool quote, one that I'll recite now is, if you really want to be specific, play your sport. And I don't mean max comp squat. I mean, go on a platform, sign up for a meet, put a singlet on, and, you know, actually compete, because that's as specific as it gets. As soon as you walk away from that platform, you're losing specificity in one aspect of it, right? So maybe velocity, the contraction velocity doesn't change, or contraction types doesn't change, but something changes. And that's just showing the malleability or the flexibility here. So when you talked about max effort work, or when you talk about it, you're using, you know, wild variations that people who raw squat would be like, you know, this loon just throwing shit on a piece of paper. But it makes sense, right? Because it's specific in different contexts. All of that to say, maybe you could explain how you go about deciding what exercises to use, how you kind of cycle through them, and why you use max effort work is even probably the first and foremost question to answer, and then how you decide to implement it, if that makes sense.
All right. So with the max effort work, it's what are we looking for, right? So we know that you can't just max out comp lifts, right? Like within 1 to 2 weeks, you'll see a deterioration of performance in terms of maxing out the competition lifts. And this has always been another aspect of training I've struggled with. Like, how much does absolute load matter in terms of recovery? And I think it matters a lot. But I think context is everything in terms of this. So what I realized is you just don't have stable performance if you're always trying to max out a competition lift. However, if you throw some variations, and the other aspect of it too is, one of the things that Shaco always talked about and why he didn't do a lot of lifts at 90% or higher is because technique would fall apart. And his whole thing was based off of the principle of dynamic organization, that the body's always looking for a more efficient way to move. So and this is the example that he would use. So if you're doing a 5x5 at whatever percentage and all 5 reps look different, you're training 5 different movement patterns. Now, again, I think context is everything. Underneath those loads, yes, you'd want to see more efficient movement patterns. However, what would end up happening in these programs is you throw heavier weight on there and technique would break down anyways. And part of it was probably psychological because people get nervous. But another part of it is like technique does need to be built up under those heavier loads. So if we can't use comp lifts, and if it's for technical reasons and recovery reasons, so we got to find a way to limit absolute loads. And what we're looking for in a max effort lift is a psychological response and a max effort strain, right? So like Louis Simmons had said this to me, and he goes, the second you realize that all strength training is just velocity, he's like, it becomes very simple. So like his whole thing, that whole force equals mass times acceleration. So a max effort lift should just be that strength speed. It should be slow velocity under heavy weights for 1 rep. So if we're just looking to develop that physiological piece to it, the exercise we choose maybe doesn't necessarily matter. So I want something that's going to be far enough away from the comp lifts that a technical breakdown is not going to negatively affect the comp lifts while getting max effort strain, while limiting loads. But at the same time, we can utilize an approach where we can target weak areas within the lifts. So if somebody has, weak hips, we can go out wider. If somebody, whatever it is, right? If they don't have the ability to strain through a rep, we can use heavier band tension instead of lighter band tension, or we can kind of choose an exercise based off of the weaknesses. But at the end of the day, all we really want is the strain, the volume flow, and that psychological response. So this is where like a well thought out longer term program becomes important. So if I'm doing that on that day, on our squats and deadlifts, it's very much like it was with Shaco. We do a lot more like competition stance, straight bar. We'll use like very slight variations to work on some type of technique issue. So if somebody has a hard time like opening up the knees in the bottom, 2-second pause squats will be in that position there. And of course the volumes would be dictated by the exercises. And then that's where back downs might come in on some other things. But, getting back to the good morning, powerlifters should care about that. Like if that is their weakness, and that's why you hire a coach, is to analyze those strengths and weaknesses. And most powerlifters, when you look, like especially in the raw world, it's very narrow stances. They wear heels like they're weightlifters, very forward knee travel. It's almost like weightlifting squats in a low bar position in the powerlifting world. I think this plays to a lot of people's strengths. So when you're looking at somebody like that, it's like, well, the back end of their body is weak. Like the low back, the hips, the hamstrings. Like to me, that person who's squatting like that probably has a really low good morning. And if you built that up over time, so let's say they're squatting 500 pounds, but they have a 300-pound good morning. That means you have 500-pound legs and a 300-pound lower back. At some point, and to quote Louis Simmons, weak things break. And even if you don't get hurt, it's going to limit performance. Like your lower back is supporting that weight that's on your shoulders. Or with the deadlift, like if you can't control your positions to get better technique because you don't have the strength to do so. So what you see a lot, like in the squat, you see people pitch forward quite a bit, and it'll be like, oh, they're pitching forward because their upper back's weak. It's like that lifter's been pitching forward for 3 or 4 years. Their upper back is strong as fuck. That's literally what's locking it up. But it's that isometric strength of the lower back in the bottom position, which 3 to 5 rep heavy good mornings is going to help fix. And one of the things that ends up happening when you start really pushing the good mornings in these types of lifters, this is the response I get all the time. I feel way more stable in the hole.
Mm.
And to me, that feeling of being stable in the hole means that they're controlling bar path better because their lower back is stronger, that isometric strength in the low back. And they're able to drive the weight to apply more vertical force into that barbell, and they're able to lift more weight. Like, that stuff matters. One other thing with the max effort lifts, so when you're analyzing strengths and weaknesses, they're all, and I've said this before, and I stole this from Dave Tate, but they're all mental, physical, or technical. So we work on our technical weaknesses on that lighter submaximal work. It worked for Shaco when he was doing his programs, and there's a lot of efficacy to that. So like, that's what we use a lot for the technical pieces. But sometimes you can't fix the technique if the physical stuff isn't addressed. And this is what I think we were seeing in our programs when we were doing more of like submaximal work, is you're not pushing that other stuff heavy enough to actually bridge that gap. So if I have 500-pound legs and a 300-pound lower back, I really need to push those good mornings. That needs to be a focal point in a block, 2 blocks, 3 blocks, until it catches up in order for me to actually get strong. And if you're not pushing that, the second you get under those heavier weights, you're in that same spot. So your body's just going to shift and do what it has to do to lock out the weight. So it's a way of addressing those weaknesses. So we can do that with the max effort work, of course. But we do good mornings at least twice a week. Straight knee deadlift variations at least once a week. So we're always targeting the hips, hamstrings, and good mornings. The hips, hamstrings, and lower back no matter what. And this is why we do a lot of box squats, because you can sit back further, really target those physical weaknesses, and really build those pieces up. And what you got to keep in mind is when you're trying to blend it all together. So if I have a max effort, if I'm going to be doing like heavier pause squats later in the week, I'm probably using some type of accommodating resistance on that max effort day to deload those positions. So there's certain positions of the lifts that just are harder to lift. We're at more of a biomechanical deficiency. And that's where I think the actual stress of recovery comes from. So if you go back to the 1960s, Westside Barbell, Culver City, who they realized they could squat 3 days a week if they added in high box squats. So even though that they were overloading them, and Pat Casey was the first 800-pound squatter in the powerlifting world, and he could do well over 1,000 pounds in a high box squat as a third squat in a week and still recover from it, because you're reducing that range of motion. You're basically just removing that biomechanically inefficient position of the squat, and you're still able to train it hard. So if you take that idea and apply it to your program, so if I'm trying to do a heavy straight weight max effort lift on day 1, I got to be careful what I'm trying to do at the bottom of a squat, day 3 and day 4. The lifter won't be able to recover from it. So you can utilize some of those ideas to make sure that you can get that max effort lift in, still the high volume stuff. And later in our programs, we max out 3 days out of the week. So we'll get our squat day 1, our bench day 2, and then we'll max out a deadlift on day 3. So being aware of those positional changes and absolute loads is really important. Like I'm probably not going to do a 1 or 2 inch deficit deadlift with straight weight and a box squat with straight weight in the same week, because that would just bang up the lifter quite a bit. So that's where I might like reduce range of motion on one of those lifts, or utilize some accommodating resistance on one of those lifts, and just kind of deload certain positions in order to allow it to flow together. So the lifter can get good results with that. And it all comes down to what you want to train in that given block of time. Like, what are we really trying to work on, and how best can I address that scenario and get the most quality training sessions possible in this block of training? I don't even know if I answered your question.
No, it did. It did perfectly. And one of my comments to that is, it's actually really interesting thinking about, because I just instantly think about weightlifting. And so we have a block of training we've been using, and we're going to repeat, a very similar formatting for a few weeks, a few blocks. And for the competition lift, we'll go off of blocks because it reduces the distance that the bar has to travel. So it removes some of the stress on the back and allows us to handle more training volume and actually work on some other physical qualities. So you have a shorter distance to pull. It means you can produce less force, or you get less time to produce more force. So you have to produce force more quickly, and you have to be able to really accelerate the bar, get up and get down with it. And the idea here is, when you talk about squatting with a box or squatting with a band to reduce where the stress is located within the movement, people get, a little upset. They don't like that. But when I say I'm going to clean and I'm going to clean off of a box, they're like, that makes perfect sense. Like that dissonance there is interesting between the sports. And that's one of the reasons I have started thinking about accommodating resistance a little differently, is it's not that we need to be really strong at the top, but maybe we just need to unload stress in the bottom. And it's just changing the way you frame these concepts uh, to change it from being super specific to what we need versus specific to the situation that we're kind of given or in, and how it can help us there. Um, so I think that's just a really interesting point. And once you stop thinking about specificity in that, in like the sense of the force velocity curve, or the way you have to apply forces in a raw squat, and you think about it in terms of just stresses in the training day, I think it actually makes a lot more sense. Or when you think of it, you said that you gave that Dave Tate quote, or when you think about it as a technical weakness. So I watch a lot of squatters who don't accelerate through the entire movement, and it doesn't upset me. I watch it and I'm like, could you just fucking push through that last like 6 inches? Could you just try a little harder? Like, why are you slowing down at the top of the lift? Because it's like almost done. And it's not that you should like jump off of the floor at the top and try and get height, like, try and get some separation. But the idea is that like the more you can push through the middle, through that sticking point, and maintain speeds. And I think maybe we think a little differently here. I think like as you get that decrease in velocity as the weight on the bar goes up, the higher the speeds are initially, in the sense of like effort and just intention, the higher the weights can be as you continue to put more on the bar, because you're not slowing down as much, or you're not sticking as much. And in weightlifting, it makes a little more sense to kind of accelerate all the way through. But I guess that was just me commenting on what you had said, and thinking about how the two sports differ a little bit in that sense, to where when we use boxes to unload stress, it's fine. But when you use boxes, at least in the raw squatting community, it's like taboo.
Yeah, I don't know why that is either. And like getting back to the like acceleration through the lift, that's important in powerlifting too, right? Because you have a limited amount of time to complete a rep. You probably have about 3 to 5 seconds before you're actually just not going to do it. And I understand we see, oh, well, this was a 10-second lift, but it's actually through those like biomechanically inefficient positions. And if we go as simple as what Louis Simmons says, right? Force equals mass times acceleration. So if you have band tension plus bar weight, there's your mass. And at some point, whether it's 500 pounds straight weight or 500 pounds bar weight plus bands, there's not a huge difference in terms of like the force application to it. Now, of course, you can't just overload bands all the time and then all of a sudden remove them and think you're going to be strong in the bottom positions. Mm-hmm. There needs to be a blend of all of it in there. But if a program is just about doing a certain amount of work, right? And we use the actual definition of work, which is work equals force, which is mass times acceleration times distance, mm-hmm. right? At the end of the day, that's all we're trying to do. So if we're shortening the distance, we can increase the mass, or mm-hmm. we can increase the acceleration, and we can keep work the same while changing the positions to allow the lifter to recover or to work on weaker positions. So Hatfield talked about compensatory acceleration training, right? Like being able to move explosively through the whole range. And we know putting max effort under light weights builds rate of force development and can aid in the right situation, can aid in increasing absolute strength, not on its own, but with, max effort work or heavier loads combined with it. You can't do that with straight weight because at some point the velocity has to reach zero at the top. Mm-hmm. So what you end up doing is you get a lot of raw lifters who are doing submaximal work and not using accommodating resistance. They get this pop and stop is what I call mm-hmm. it. They pop mm-hmm. out of the hole, coast to the top. They do the same thing on the bench. They pop off the chest, coast to the top. Mm-hmm. And they don't develop that like punching through the repetition, which is something that they have to do because that bar has to keep moving. If that bar ever stops, even on a squat, even when it looks like it stops, it's moving up at an extremely slow velocity because you're never going to stop it and then restart it. Mm-hmm. So what at least like bands do in that case, one, if you're a coach and you don't know where their weaknesses lie, it at least overloads their sticking point no matter what. But it disallows that pop and stop. Like they will get crushed under that weight. So they learn how to handle that band tension. Now, that'll build a physical strength. In terms of technical pieces with the bands, yes, too much of it is bad. The bands ground the weight and they control the bar path. Like the bands pull the bar down. So in terms of physical strength, it's over speed eccentrics. It's like a depth jump except for power. So it's pulling you down faster, and it'll stress that stretch shortening cycle a lot more. So you remove the bands, you're more explosive coming out of the hole. So it's going to build that physical strength. But again, the technical components of the bands grounding the weight and controlling the bar path has some negative pieces to it. It's just something that the coach needs to understand in a larger picture of a program that, all right, if I'm using bands here, and maybe they don't care because they're 6 months out from their next competition or something, but you just make sure you're addressing that concept on the other training days. And it doesn't even have to be in the same week. Like I might use bands for 2 weeks and then just sneak in some comp lift reps on week 3 just to keep them fresh enough and let them touch it and just kind of see how things are going. Like you don't have to just stick to doing the same things all the time, and it doesn't have to be week to week, but within a month, I want to make sure I'm touching a comp lift somewhere. And what I started to do now is on week 4, I give them 80% comp lifts for like doubles or triples just to see what it looks like. If it's going well, great. If it's not, all right, well, maybe we need to touch a few more of these, or here's where it's breaking down. It just gives us some direction. So I get the max effort progress to dictate my decision making, and I get the comp lift progress at 80% to kind of help dictate some decision making for the next block of training that we're going into. But it's just, I think you get a lot of coaches. Powerlifting's odd, especially in America, because it's run by like mechanical engineers and computer geeks, and where in Russia there's sports scientists. So we don't get sports scientists that are actually like in control of dictating our development of powerlifters. They care more about field sports. Mm-hmm. So it just becomes easier to use an Excel spreadsheet to kind of dictate some training volumes and intensities that seem to work well under certain conditions and stuff. Where when you're actually like analyzing a lifter, it's like, okay, so where upon that, like we'll use the strength velocity curve, where upon that strength velocity curve are they strong? Where are they weak? Where are their physical limitations? Whether it's in developing that velocity, that strength speed, that speed strength, their work capacity, weakness at certain angles, weakness in certain muscle groups. How do they handle psychologically? How do they handle the max effort work? Because you'll have people who are like, oh, well, max effort work is too taxing. I can't take singles often. Motherfucker, you just chose a sport that is nothing but singles. Like go do CrossFit if you can't handle singles. And part of that as a coach, it's my job to give them the psychological tools to be able to handle more work. So yes, there's like a stress inoculation that you get from max effort work, but we talk a lot about the psychology of training and mindset and attention and focus and how to handle your emotions. Like you give them the tools to handle that. So, you're trying to build a well-rounded athlete, one that's, that can move light loads quickly, one that can strain under heavier weights, one that has good technical efficiency under lighter loads and heavier loads, and one that's mentally resilient, whether they miss a rep, whether they make a rep, whether it's a PR, whether it's not a PR, whether it's a weight they've never seen before, or it's a weight that might have crushed them a couple of times before. Like our goal is to identify those weaknesses, pick the ones that we think are going to have the biggest bang for our buck, and address them in our training program that follows a well laid out periodized model that keeps us in line and gives us direction over the longer term.
Yeah, one trap I fell into, just thinking back to how I used to program, is I used to think that things should always change. And I kind of thought about this from like mesocycle to mesocycle, or, training block to training block, or, whatever terms you use to describe it. Every like 4 to 6 weeks, you change the training. So it's a different kind of stress. And I think I got too far down that rabbit hole to where now I'll write out, maybe 8 to 12 weeks, and it'll look very similar, like eerily similar. But again, it's just as a coach, as you develop, you are able to apply like more concepts, but also like more depth to the concepts. So how we talked about specificity before, I would just think of it as it needs to look just like a competition squat or a competition clean and jerk. It needs to look like that, and therefore it's specific. But then you realize that a muscle is a muscle, and it has certain attributes, and you know, it operates in a certain way, and the human body has 600 plus muscles, and it kind of works as a unit. And when you figure out how to utilize the tendencies of a muscle, like when it's put on extreme stretch quick, it tends to contract more forcefully. You can use different exercises to develop that, and you're not so reliant on just like, I need to get it bigger, or, you know, one variable doesn't become the major influencer, basically. So the way I look at programming is I'm not looking at just one major variable, such as variability, as the driver. So we can do the same exact mesocycle and just chop reps down, or maybe we just make, you know, a subtle change, or maybe we just, you know, change the max effort variation in the middle of the week, or, you know, we just do something a little different, but I don't overhaul it. And, you know, I kind of forget where I was taking this entirely. But anyways, Matt, the idea is that you can repeat blocks that work on the weakness of the athlete over and over and over, and it's not ineffective, or it's not useless, or it's not like monotonous, as long as you're making other changes elsewhere, right? So I think you just develop this more like total view of a program as you become a better coach, or understand the coaching process or the general principles a little more effectively. And this is actually something I picked up from ETSU and Dr. Kyle Pierce, who worked with Michael Stone pretty closely. Is his program, he ran the same exact program with an Olympian. So from start to finish, he ran the exact same program with very slight modifications the entire time he was a weightlifter. And this is a guy who went to, I think he went to 3 Olympics, and he was the best American weightlifter for a very long time. I mean, it's a 12-year span where you are the best. And he did the exact same program. And it was a very traditional, block periodized, American model program. 10, 5, 3, 2, all 10s, all 5s, all 3s, 2s, peak. And then he would recycle through it. And it was like very few competition lifts. The first block, it was just like a maintenance load or retention load or like skill work. It was like 70% for a bunch of singles. It's this high-low method we're talking about. And then the heavy day was like off the blocks, and it was like a max set of 5. And then as the weeks go on, the next block is just a max set of 3, and then it's like heavier competition lifts, lower volume. And the next block, it's like, you know, cut down even more, higher intensities. Anyways, I guess again, the overarching concept is it's simple, and it's working on these very general concepts, these very important concepts, and repeating it over and over and over again. And not that training should be the same all of the time. I just think there should be less variability. And if you find a weakness, don't get away from it. And Louis Simmons, actually heard him on a podcast mention this. He said, if I knew someone's lower back or hamstrings were weak, you best believe, and these aren't his words, obviously, Louis doesn't sound like this, but you best believe we're attacking that 4 or 5 times a week, or like 3 to 5 times a week, or whatever it was. But we're going to target it repeatedly over and over and over until it's not a weakness, or just until it kind of rises up to the rest of the ships. And I think that's what people get away from, because they assume you have to vary training, you have to change the focus, you have to do all these things, and you really don't. And I think consistency for people who aren't at a really high level is actually something they need. They need a consistent stress. They need it appropriately placed with the right exercises, or the right technical drills, or the right tools to develop them technically and physically. Because a muscle is a muscle. You know, maybe it becomes monotonous when it is responding to the same training load over and over and over. But if you change the angle slightly, or, you know, you do all these things incrementally, it's not like it's going to stop getting bigger or stop getting stronger, or you're not going to get more technical. I don't know if you have anything to say to that. I can introduce the next topic if that was just like a whole lot of nothing. But
no, I actually, that's a great point. So like how I was saying before, if somebody can't handle the 5x5s and we have to, let's say, regress it back to 12x2s or 8x3s or something to get that volume in, I'll repeat. So let's say they do those 8x3s and they're putting RPE 8 to 9 or something for that last set RPE. I'll keep repeating that until it drops to a 7.
Mm-hmm.
Like, to me, that shows that they're recovering, they're adapting, and they're ready for more. I think repeating things over and over until you get the result you're looking for. Like, if they, let's say week 1 they put RPE 9 and week 2 they put an RPE 8, that is still progressive overload. It's progressive overload of efficiency. Mm. And then if we get that next week and they're putting in RPE 7, we've progressed 3 weeks in a row using the exact same thing. And as a coach, it gives me a lot of good feedback to make those future adjustments. If they're putting a 9, the next week they're putting a 9, the next week they're putting a 9 or a 9.5 or something for that last set RPE, they're not adapting and they're not recovering. I need to adjust under that circumstance. So maybe that's where we go to a 12x2 or a 10x2, or we figure something else out in that scenario to get that work in and to start them out, get them recovering and get them moving in the right direction. I think repeating stuff is really important in terms of that, or it's just a bunch of noise that you're trying to sift through in a program when things work or they don't work.
Yeah, I'd like to hear, because I mentioned this at the start of the call before we ended up going live, but how much do you think your personality, and it's actually really funny because I have struggled with this, because I know Kevin, you and I both follow the same crowds of people. We both listen to the same people, the same podcasts, read the same stuff. Not all of it, but some of it. And probably went down this rabbit hole of, the whole like pain science thing and all this stuff. And you basically, what that told me is I should try and be more empathetic, try and be more supportive of the person. And I got to thinking about, like, within a session, how I'm operating with an athlete I'm coaching. How much should I work on changing my personality to fit the situation and the person's needs? And every time you talk on camera, it's kind of funny because for people listening who haven't seen his Patreon videos, which I'm probably most of you, so go sign up. There's someone in the background. Her name's Jessie Birdie. And, they kind of have a back and forth, and they always talk about how mean Kevin is, and how kind of like, maybe aggressive he is when he coaches. And I was thinking about that. Like, sometimes you just need to be true to yourself. That sounds like the corniest thing I've ever said. But you need to be true to your coaching style or your coaching personality and not try and sugarcoat it. And that's what I've tried to kind of come to terms with. But how much do you think coaching personality dictates not only coach-athlete relationship interaction, but then the training process itself of, my personality is I like to go heavy. I like to train hard. I like to push the envelope. Like, when I made the goal of rowing 2,000 meters at under 7 minutes, the first thing I did was row as hard as I could every single day until eventually, like, my traps were fucking fried. I couldn't turn my head, and I'm like, okay, I'll do it once or twice a week, 3 times a week, and try and be more moderate and conservative. But my personality immediately is to go as hard as I can and to see what happens and to earn it. But how much do you think coaching personality plays into all of that? And how much do you think there should be, because we talk about understanding programming, understanding the principles, and changing that to accommodate the situation. What about the personality aspect, the more like psychosocial aspects of the training process?
I think that's huge. So I read this book, and it's a great book, and every coach should read it. It's called Coaching the Mental Game, but it talks about wearing different hats for different athletes. And this guy was a psychologist for Major League Baseball for the most part, but other pro athletes and stuff. And he uses a lot of examples in the book about, like, oh, well, this person needed me to yell at him. This person needed me to be more sincere and all of that stuff. But what I realized over time is you can only be great at being one person, and that's yourself. I'm not that, like, coddling. You're very rarely going to get any type of positive reinforcement from me because, like, compliments build complacency, and people always want to hear the positive, but then they miss the negative at times. So, like, you could come out from a huge PR and I'm going to let you know exactly what you fucking did wrong right away. And like one of the things that we always talk about is you can never get too high or too low. Like, because no matter what, whether you make that last rep or you miss the last rep, the what you need to do next doesn't change. You still need to be focused and you still need to dominate the next repetition, whether it's in a different lift, whether it's the next training day, no matter when it is, your focus should already be on executing that next repetition, whether you make it or miss it. And one of the things that I think really dictates my coaching style is all successful and unsuccessful people want the same fucking things. Like if you ask anybody, what's your goal? Oh, I want to compete at nationals and win a national championship. But the difference between the ones who actually succeed and do it and the ones who don't are the ones who actually focus on the process. So I think every coach needs to have a value system, right? Like one of our things is dominate every rep in training. You need to be accountable. You need to be committed. So if you have a goal, commit to it. Commit to dominating the next rep in training. And you need to persevere when shit hits the fan. And it's this focus on removing the focus on the external outcomes and focusing on the process at hand. So like for me, my attitude needs to dictate those values that I'm trying to instill in my lifters. And this is the majority of the people that we're going to have in front of us are never going to win a world championship. Most of them will never compete on a national stage. I think nationals is the top 10% or something like that. So that means 90% of the people partaking in this sport will never be able to accomplish those things. But, you know, this is like a John Wooden coaching philosophy. But you're taking them and instilling these life skills that are going to make them better at their jobs, better at being a husband or wife, better at being a mother or father or whatever it is. And you can put these values that give them a lot of positive outcomes in life. And I think the whole personality changing of like, oh, it's okay, you missed this rep, like focusing on that, like that doesn't do anybody any good. But being like, you know, holding them accountable and being a little bit harder on them at times, I think is incredibly important to getting them to have the right mindset. So like we take a lot of singles. Like you better be able to psychologically handle it. And to be honest, like there were times when I'm coaching in person where I know somebody struggles to handle that psychological stress. I might just yell at them for no fucking reason, but like find a reason to yell at them and just like create more of a psychological arousal to it. So like, let's see how they respond to this. And like over time, it just becomes this. And of course, the other people in the team help balance it out, right? It's like a yin and yang. When they're like, oh, Kevin's always just yelling at something or whatever. Like balance them out. But like I realized like that's my personality. And if you have these high, lofty goals, whether it's in the sport or in life, like I've always responded well to like coaches that were a lot harder. And I think it's really important. And this is why like I was like, you know what, I'm going to do nothing but singles for a year. So if somebody wants to tell me that they can't handle doing a max effort lift twice a week, I can be like, go fuck yourself. I did it for an entire year, every training day. Like being in the trenches and training harder than everybody else in that group is really important, I think, in order for me getting buy-in, getting respect. And it has nothing to do with the weight on the bar. It just has to do with that output that you're putting in. And I think it's really important that they see that you're not complaining, that you're handling missed reps, that you're how you're handling made attempts. And I think I made this switch because like I was like, oh, well, this person needs this person needs that. And I just realized that like, this isn't me and they're not getting the most out of me. And I would try to make my programs fit the individual as opposed to, no, these are the programs. Like in any team sport I ever played, this is how you did it. And like, I just realized, I think the second that I realized that not everybody's going to be a good fit, right? So like Shako has a system, Louis has a system, the Bulgarians, the Greeks, no matter who they are, they have a system. The people who don't fit their system, they get their certificate and they get kicked out. And that's kind of like how it's going to work. If you want to have a competitive and a good team, like not everybody's a good fit. And, here in New England with the Patriots, like they've brought people in the past, like Chad Johnson, when he came in, he wasn't a good fit. They got rid of him and they end up winning with people who have the same mindset, the same goals, the same, everybody's on the same page. And there's this book I recommend every coach reads. I had to read it during my internship at Harvard, where it's called Energy Bus. It takes like an hour to read. It's really short, but like
TLDR, it's basically everybody needs to be on the same bus moving in the same direction and getting off at the same stop for it to be completely efficient. So if you're a coach and you're constantly changing things up to match one person and then be different towards another, there becomes resentment amongst the lifters, I think, at times. If you're doing that, it's like, oh, well, this person's his favorite. It's like, no, I'm just babying this person because they're a fucking baby. Like, I think it ruins the environment a little bit. And I think it's really important too, like when you're hard on them like that in training and you push them and you ride them hard, when they go to a competition, it's the easiest day of training for them. And when they turn and they look at you and you have that same stoic look on your face, like you're not nervous, you're not overly excited, you expect them to do what they do every single day in training. I think that's really important for them as they're walking out to take those attempts, whether it's on a big stage, a local meet. It sets the stage and it sets the tone for training, for competition and everything else. And I think it's really important that like every coach be that person. Like, you can only be Joshua Gibson. You can't be Kevin Cann, and vice versa. And I think that made a huge difference in terms of how I coach and how I actually like act in training. And like, if they're not following those values, they're going to hear from me. But if they're working hard and doing all the things that they're supposed to do, like, I don't care about the weight on the bar. And yeah, your technique might suck. Like, the majority of the people I coach aren't gifted lifters. But if you want them to be the best versions of themselves in a sport and outside of that sport, like, you instill those values in them and you really enforce them, almost like a parent at times, I guess. But like, it goes a long way in terms of them. Like, we have a problem in powerlifting. I don't know if weightlifting's like this, where you don't get a lot of people sticking around long term. I think a big part of it is because everybody's just focused on these external outcomes, right? So if it's 5 years and then you quit, I think what you end up seeing is that's about the time period that PRs kind of stop coming pretty easily. You know, people start in the sport, they gain some weight, they're beginners, they get beginner gains, and you get this good progress, stalls out maybe after 3 years, you get frustrated and you end up quitting around year 5. And I think part of that is because it's a sport without role models. We have no value system in the sport. Like, in terms of like playing soccer, doing the MMA stuff that I was doing earlier on, it's like, okay, 5 years in the sport, if I was playing soccer, I'd be 10 years old. I wasn't elite then. Like, it takes a long period of time. So I think it's really important to even try to get people to stick around the sport longer than that 5-year period that, you know, people tend to wash out on.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know how we could top that. That was incredible. And it was a lot of confirmation bias on my end, because I kind of felt a similar way. You know, you try to accommodate each individual person and you kind of make up this story of, you know, well, they're paying me and, you know, it's a recreational sport. It's something they don't have to do. And, you know, you try to save business. And at the end of the day, it's not worth it. And I've actually found that people like my coaching style. That's kind of like an organic, natural style. It's just, you know, it's relatively no nonsense. Nothing anyone does is spectacular. It's just kind of like, you know, you made a lift. It was decent. Like, we got a lot to work on. Let's keep chipping at it. And you're not going to get overly complimented for it. And you just expect people to show up. And you have these standards, and you know that you just kind of always operate as under the banner of this is the way it should be. And when people fulfill that and they execute and they come through, it isn't, you know, a pat on the back and a nice job. It's like, okay, you did what you should do. And it's funny you mentioned maxing out every day. I actually, when I started weightlifting, my influences were two guys who trained with. So one guy trained with a Bulgarian coach, Ivan Abadjiev, and a couple of his lifters, who, you know, started that whole like Bulgarian method, like trend. He was the impetus for it. He started it in Bulgaria, and there was a guy who trained under him. He trained with another guy, and they had a podcast, and they talked about, you know, you don't get better at weightlifting by being in the squat rack or the dumbbell rack or anything. You get better by snatching and clean and jerking. You get better by maxing out, going to maximum as often as possible. So the way I trained, green to weightlifting, after about 5 or 6 months, I worked with a coach, got my technique down, for the most part. I mean, it was still pretty bad, but it was passable. I did a really simple program, didn't care for it. It was 6 weeks. It built up to a test, and I'm like, okay, this is great. Like I snatched, 100 kilos, whatever. And then I started maxing out every day, and I did that for a span of time until eventually, like, my knee just hurt so much I could not. But I literally would put my life on the line to make weights and hit PRs, and it was great for me because I know how it feels, and I know that I love the sport because I just like to train hard and train heavy, and I get a lot of enjoyment out of that. So I don't need much more. Like, I don't need someone to tell me good job, or I don't need medals, or don't need any of that other BS. It's not like it's a bad thing. I just don't need that. I just love to weightlift because I love to weightlift. Just like, when I go to the gym, I want to push something heavy. I want to find an exercise I can go hard on. And I'm kind of using all of that to set up the scene of, that's now the way I interact with my athletes. Is it's like, yeah, I mean, this is just kind of what's expected of you. I mean, if you want to be a good weightlifter, you have to lift heavy weights. Like you said, the sport is lifting a heavy single. So you have to do that. And, there are accommodations for each individual person, the amount of work they can handle and whatnot. But I think just not compromising on what the sport is and then what your values are is huge. And it's something I've had to learn over time. And I think some of the reason people don't stick around is because they have their preconceived notion of what it is or what it should be. And it's just because they haven't been around the block, so to speak. And it's the same way with programming, right? I'm sure we both got onto this interesting kick, and it's like, look at this new program. I think this is so novel and so different. And then eventually you learn a lot more about it, and you're like, well, guys from the 90s and the 80s and early 2000s were using this type of programming or this style of programming or this format for training, and it worked for good reason. And that's probably what I'll use. And I'll add my own little sprinkle here and there, but I'm not going to reinvent the wheel, because people have tried to do that, and they've figured out that, you can only change so much before it just gets really complicated and really messy. And maybe it looks good within the training day or the training week. But once you start stacking chips, months and months and months and years, just it muddies everything. So you have to have some sort of simplicity. You have to have some sort of system, and you have to have something that just can repeat itself over and over and over. And that's how you track progress. That's how you make progress. But yeah, Kevin, man, this was an awesome podcast. I think I covered most of my topics. Was there anything that I missed, or anything that you kind of wanted to touch on really quickly before we wrap up?
I just want to piggyback off of what you were just saying about stacking chips. I think, being a sport, like I was saying, like a sport without role models and powerlifting, right? Like the older guys aren't on, like Louis Simmons told me at breakfast. He's like, I'm not on the internet, and I don't want to be on the internet. And it's like, well, there's part of the problem, right? Is like, people don't really know, right? I mean, he's written a lot, and he's been out there with his DVDs and stuff, but a lot of those older powerlifters are just they're not on the internet, right? And this younger generation is just smarter than everybody else. And I was actually reading a lot about social science stuff and about deconstructing current worldviews to replace it with something new. And it's just this modern day political atmosphere that bleeds into science at times. And one of the things that you end up seeing is you have all these concepts, right? So I use a constraints-led approach in that dynamic systems theory aspect in my training. But it's just sprinkled into the larger picture because it's still a theory, and it's probably more wrong than it is right. But there was a time, and I think we can all relate to this, even with pain science or whatever, where you'll read stuff in the scientific literature and it's this makes a lot of sense on paper. It's very intellectual. It's written out in a way in which you're oh, I can relate to that. It gives you, it's oh, that's why, supercompensation doesn't exist and peaking is unnecessary because of all of these aspects. And it's you read John Kiley's work, and John Kiley, when I read it originally, I was fuck periodization. And then now when I go back and I read it, it's that's not what he's saying.
Yeah.
He's saying here are some holes in that. Here are some things you need to think about when you're writing your programs or your long-term or short-term plans and stuff, and like where you want to address these things. He's asking questions, and it's good questions that should make you think and make you come up with a plan. But a lot of these things, they look so good on paper, and they're so intellectual, and they're so smart. But once you start actually applying them in the real world, you're like, yeah, no, this doesn't fucking work. Mm-hmm. It doesn't work. And I think you see that just a lot, like in strength training. Like, I hate bringing this up because people get pissed, but it's like, there is a better technical way to perform the lifts. There absolutely is. Like, even if you take like physics equations, right? If I can shorten the distance and just train the shit out of it over a longer period of time, I don't need to be stronger. I just need to better utilize leverages to lift more weight and have a better outcome within the sport itself. And, you get into this like, oh, well, there's a ton of variability with every time you move. And it's like, yes, we know this. The principle of dynamic organization has been a thing since the 1970s. We understand that every movement's different and that the body's searching for a better movement, but it's not this like free pass to just do whatever you want. And it's like, well, this works best for me. It's like, well, you squat 300 pounds. Like, sick. It works great for you now. But how are you going to squat 700, 800, 900 pounds? Like, there's not science that shows that, and it just comes back to like those old school powerlifters that their experience, just subjective feelings have kind of superseded objective truths in terms of these older powerlifters have figured out ways in which they were able to lift massive amounts of weight, but because it doesn't have a PMID attached to it, people don't want to listen to it. And it's like, I had this conversation with Mike Teixeira recently too, because I was like, I tend to lean a lot more towards, and he agreed with this, a lot more towards those people who came before us. Like, I had Vince Anello on my podcast, and like, it's like, yeah, I understand some of the things he's saying have been scientifically disproven to be true, but there's something to it. Like, he was the first man under 200 pounds to deadlift 800 pounds. Like, he figured some stuff out, and like, maybe science can help us interpret how we figured that stuff out a little bit more. And Mike was telling the story of Fred Hatfield, who had a very unique tapering strategy back in the day. And I mean, this guy squatted over 1,000 pounds. And he's like, well, he had talked about like blowing out type 2 motor units or something. And it's like, and somebody, and one of Mike's like PhD friends was just kind of laughing. And like, Mike's like, I understand that that's not true. But there's something to this. Like, they figured that stuff out, and just, we lost that aspect of it. So now it's like a brand new sport all over again, even though like the glory days of sports science was in the 1970s, and we've just forgotten about all of that stuff. Like, there was a lot of really good science that came out of those, like Russia and Hungary later on, and Norway, and like and those other countries that have done this. Like, Russia did it for 4 Olympic training cycles. So that's literally 16 years of analyzing the programs and data of these lifters, where raw lifting's been around for not even 2 Olympic training cycles. But like, we've kind of deconstructed the old way of doing stuff, and we're trying to replace it with like this newer way. And I think what ends up happening is you get this experience gap. So where most lifters and coaches haven't been in the sport for even 5 years, there's no long-term vision. So you just get these coaches who write these programs that just throw a ton of stimulus at people. And the ones who survive the stimulus get really strong, really, really quickly, and see such great results. And it's this pat on the back. We figured things out. They win world championships, but then they go away because of injuries, or they just can't sustain it over the longer period of time. And I think this is another problem with the long-term development of the sport, where if I was able to get my hands on some of the like American raw world champion powerlifters programs, and like, these are recommended volumes that were just way higher than anything Sheiko would have ever given anybody. And they're at intensities that are much higher than he would have given people too. And it's like, yes, this is a ton of stimulus, and you have some gifts to be able to recover from this stimulus and adapt at the rate in which you're adapting from. But what happens over the long term? So maybe you get this spike in 5 years and then you fall off. But what happens if we had a more steady spike that lasted 10, 15, 20 years? Maybe you're setting even larger world records further in the future, and it's a sport that you can stick with longer in life. And I think we've lost that like longer term view. And I don't know if weightlifting is the same way, but in powerlifting anyways, it's like all of a sudden the world started over in 2013 when raw lifting started to become more popular.
No, I actually, and you might get a kick out of this. It is a weightlifting podcast that I recorded, but it was with Glenn Pendlay before he passed, and the topic was new school versus old school weightlifting. And the way I kind of broke it down was looking at recovery methods, techniques, programming, etc. And I said, okay, Glenn, you've been around since, I mean, he was a junior world champion powerlifter.
Yeah.
He was coached and learned under Medvedev in Russia. Spent a few weeks there. He coached a huge amount of weightlifters in the 90s in Texas, and then in the 2000s, and then moved to California and coached world team members, and moved to the Carolinas and coached more world team members. And like he's just been around for, he was around for like 30 years in weightlifting, 25 years. A lot of experience. So I said, what was the difference between new school and old school? And like, what was that dividing line? And he said, it was the birth and growth of the internet. He's like, that's the difference. He said, because in weightlifting, we really figured out the technique or the pull in the 80s. And he said, of course, it was kind of the idea of course, there could be new science or new information emerging that shows us there's a better way to do it or a different way to do it. But a lot of this information, he even mentioned that like old school bodybuilders, I think Reg Park or something. Anyways, he would use like 5x5s and make crazy progress and get very strong. And then he kind of recounted stories of old bench pressers benching every day and maxing out. And basically he said that like all of these ideas have been tried and tested. And maybe the explanations aren't correct. Maybe they're wrong, or maybe they're different. Maybe we figure things out about why they work. But what we do know is that they do work, and that trying to formulate some new opinion or approach it's kind of fruitless. And it's not fruitless in that it's wrong, but I think just discounting all of that information and maybe it's kind of the imposter syndrome. When I learned a lot about how Glenn does things and how other great coaches did and do things, I don't want to copy their programming. I don't want to say, hey, pay me money and you can get something almost exactly like what they would give you. The thing is, it works, and it works really well. And yeah, we make modifications, and yeah, we do things slightly differently, and maybe we mix and match, and maybe we use some stuff from like the ETSU school of thought, with all the heavy shrugs and all the heavy pulls and all the strength work. And then maybe we use the on the minute work or the EMOMs, or the clusters, the short rest stuff like what Westside would do. And, maybe we just kind of mix and match and get it all in a similar program. And then we run that over time. But I'm definitely not inventing anything. And I'd be lying if I said that I was. And some of these concepts, resistance priming, it sounds fancy. It sounds interesting. It sounds novel. But they were probably doing it in China. They were probably doing it in Russia. I mean, they've got this shit down. It's just that like my lack of information leads me to think it's new, when really it's just like my shortcoming, and that's really all it is. That's the difference. It's like everyone's shortcoming is what makes it seem like it's something different or new, when in reality, like someone's done it, tested it. We just maybe didn't know exactly why. So like with tapers, people wonder, is it the like type 2 overshoot? Right. Is it pulling back on the volume? And we know with detraining that typically muscle fibers will convert to a faster type. Is that the reason? I don't know. Maybe. Does it work? Yeah, most of the time, for the most part. I mean, there are some circumstances in which you don't really need to taper, but people rest. People take an extra day off. There's a decrease in volume. There's an increase in intensity. Like, come on. It isn't as different as a lot of people want to lead you to believe. And even I tried to lead people to believe. It's all kind of the same. But yeah, that was a good rant to end on. So Kevin, all of this information and even more, I mean, it's a disgusting amount of information you have on your Patreon. What exactly, so where is that? Where can people go to sign up? And then what can they expect if they do, want to sign up for a month to try everything out, or to become a patron to your account?
So when I was coming up with Patreon, so like I was tossing around the idea. So one of the things that's really important to me with my lifters is educating them. I want them to be extensions of me, to make good training decisions, to understand why we're doing things, to be like, because there are times where it's like, all right, well, you have this weakness, and for them to be like, you know what, I think this exercise works best for me, or to identify things that maybe I can't see and stuff like that. So I felt it was really important to explain to them my thought process in training. And that's what I wanted to make the Patreon channel, is just like my thought process. So like, I actually have to make an addendum to the phases video that I did, because when I was doing it originally, and then I analyzed the programs in my past programs, I realized our volumes were too low in the month. So instead of like waiting for things to work and then, or how they play out and then saying them, I want to just everybody to see my thought process. So you can see me fuck up like that along the way to finding a better way of doing it. Cause I think that's really important, because I think the majority of coaches out there don't see how many times we screw up before we find a right way. And, I think identifying that stuff, and it's almost like I thought of like almost making like an internship, or just like, like how my brain works, and try to just dump everything onto there. And, so there'll be a lot of rambling, and there'll be a lot of me fucking up and me pulling stuff back and me analyzing things, but you can see the growth in the process that happens along the way. And I don't think that exists anywhere else. I think you end up just seeing everybody's finished product instead of the actual process of developing that product. And we're in the, I've been doing this now for a while, and I'm in the process of developing my own system. So like I had said before, we were going week to week, but now I have it set up in a way that every 4 to 6 months we're peaking for something. Just because that tends to be the typical time in between competitions. But even if we don't have a competition, they're taking comp lifts in those periods of time. So we have 4 to 6 month longer term development programs now. And now it's just about like developing it even longer and developing a system like the Greeks have, like the Russians have. And maybe I can even like develop it in a way where there's beginners, intermediates, and I have some heuristics based off of like that type of data that comes up. But it's the actual process of seeing this stuff laid out, not the finished product. And I think that's extremely valuable and extremely different than everything else that's out there. So that's why there's so much information. It's just like, well, here's a thought. I'm going to put it down, no matter how stupid it sounds, and we'll see how it plays out. And I try to at least do a video at least once a week in there to keep up with it. But it's $20 a month. I even have some programs up there so that like if you wanted to run them, they're not made to be run as is, but they're made to be like viewed, and then all the information with it to make the adjustments as needed based off of how training's going. And I respond to all the messages that I get. So like I have people message me every day on there about like some of the stuff, and it's patreon.com/precision powerlifting.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that I found very interesting is for someone like myself who has a background in this, it's useful to see the kind of, it's almost broken up like a research paper. You get like an introduction, and then you get some sort of like method, and then you get the discussion. And to me, that just makes sense, right? You introduce a concept, you talk about how it's used in practice, and then you actually write a program, and then you kind of break it down. And there's a lot more than just giving people kind of these abstract concepts or just saying how it's used in training, because as a coach, I feel like I need to be able to explain it to every single person who walks in the gym. So for example, yesterday I had a girl, she said, how do I get stronger? And she's a rank beginner. Like she does like physique stuff, and she wants to, very much a rank beginner. I'm teaching her to squat, press, deadlift, bench, like very, very basic. And she said, how do I get stronger? And it was actually a challenge to figure out how to explain it to someone who knows absolutely nothing. And this is contrasted against another girl who's a rank beginner to weightlifting and lifting weights and generally, but she's in med school. So she has like a deep physiology background, probably knows a bit about biomechanics and all that stuff. So for her, it's easy. It's easy to explain strength. It's like, okay, we're trying to get the nervous system to make a muscle more efficient, to use more of the muscle to disinhibit some of the mechanisms that keep you from producing. Like you can get sciencey about it, but when someone who knows absolutely nothing and says, how do I get stronger? That's a challenge. And what I like about, again, just kind of going off on your Patreon and talking it up, but I really like it, you're able to explain it in great depth and detail, and then show it, and then run through an example, and then answer questions. So you're just getting such a comprehensive overview of a topic that I feel like I have a good grasp on bands and why I would use them, and I could probably explain it to people now. Whereas before, it's like rate of force development, yeah, but it wasn't so much about the whole fatigue thing and just unloading a portion of the lift and all that stuff. So I like it. I would recommend people go subscribe, check it out. I mean, at the very least, just get a month, watch everything, and then cancel. Just
Yeah, exactly.
at the very least, right? But also, if the Patreon is something people are interested in, and they also want to follow you on Instagram and all of those other social media channels, where can they head to find you there?
So my personal page is KW Cann, CANN, and then our team's Precision Powerlifting Systems. That's all I use for social media. It's a cesspool. Anything further than that.
Yeah. So, man, this was a great conversation. I think we really covered a lot and really went in on the topics we had. And for people listening, I was thinking about making this a more regular segment with Kevin. Just again, because he has so much content. I feel like we could help, or I could help kind of bring some of what he, talks about for hours and hours on his Patreon onto like a podcast format as a way to introduce it. And then if you want to, again, see programs or learn more about it, you can go sign up and get access to him personally and all of the information up there. And who knows? I mean, if you're a power lifter, someone who just wants to get brutally strong and have fun doing it. And when I say fun, I mean, go heavy, do technique work, put in the time, which is fun for me. Go sign up for his coaching too. It's a good opportunity. So Kevin, any last words?
I think we said a lot of words in this podcast. Nobody wants to hear anymore.
I agree. So everyone listening, as always, thanks for giving us your time. If you want to rate the podcast, go do that. If you want to share it with your friends, your family, your animals, whoever you so choose, feel free to do that. And we will catch you next time on another episode of the Philosophical Weightlifting Podcast.